Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to you all in great numbers to tonight's lecture. I myself am Anne Winter. I'm at the Department of History at the VUB. And before I start the introduction, I'll kindly ask you to switch off your mobile phones as far as you haven't done that yet. So, welcome to you all to the first edition of the 2018-2019 Stadsalons Urbains lecture series that revolves around the theme Migration, Racialization and Everyday Resistance in European Cities. Organized by a number of research groups at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels together with the Brussels Academy, the lecture series will address major aspects of contemporary politics and everyday life in European cities, focusing on questions of migration, racism, policing, gendered violence, socio-racial segregation, urban unrest, far-right agitation, and everyday resistance. We have a wonderful lineup, I'll show you the lineup, of 7 critical intellectuals from across Europe, with lectures taking place more or less monthly between now and April 2019. We're very happy to reach such a large audience, and we look forward very much to engaging with you in stimulating reflection in the coming months. I take the opportunity in particular to highlight the next upcoming lectures by Yasmina Bibijan on race, migration and post-colonial imaginary on November 30th, and Ayse Chaglar on migrants, disempowered cities and polarization of politics on December the 14th. Now, today we are very happy to kick off this lecture series with a lecture by Leo Lucassen entitled Against Integration Pessimism, Lessons from Migration History. Now, Leo Lucassen is and does many things at the same time. He is both research director of the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, and he is professor of global labor and migration history at the University of Leiden. He's an internationally respected expert in the history of migration, social inequality, policing, state formation and urbanization, and has published widely in these fields. Now, characteristic for Leo's publications is that he not only publishes specialist work in prestigious international journals and book series, but also writes books intended for a broader interested audience, such as most recently the revised edition of Vijf Eeuwen Migratie, een verhaal van winnaars en verliezers, 5 centuries of migration, a story of winners and losers, on migration to the Netherlands in a long-term perspective, together with Jan Lucassen, and the book itself will be available after the lecture there at my right-hand corner, your left-hand corner in the back, for the price of €22, and please notice that we can only accept cash, and we would be very grateful if you have the exact amount, €22. Now, Leo does so because he consciously aims to transcend the relatively restricted environment of academic discussions by using his scholarly expertise to engage in broader societal debates. And in recent years, he has in this context also been a regular guest in television, debates and talk shows, and has been very present in the press in the form of op-eds and interviews. So he's also often invited as an expert in national and European policy commissions and panels in matters of migration policy. So Leo is therefore for both an academic historian and a public intellectual. The historical dimension is very present in everything he does, but at the same time there is also a clear present-day finality to contribute to better insight and better solutions concerning contemporary societal challenges. So by showing how long-term perspectives can be helpful and useful to deal with present-day challenges, Leo's work also demonstrates the added value of bringing in history at a time when many debates are too often dissociated from their historical context. History matters. So we are therefore very proud and very glad to open this year's Stadsalons Urbains lecture series with Leo Lucassen, who will discuss the relevance of migration history for present-day challenges with the title Against Integration Pessimism, Lessons from Migration History.
Thank you, Anne, for this flattering introduction. I feel a bit like a coach driver with a lot of people in the front and in the back. I hope everyone can hear and see me, but I see there are some devices that help us with that. Okay, in the current public and political debate, when migration is brought up, the apocalypse is never far away. Let me just start with giving you some examples. This is in Dutch. Thierry Baudet, who is a politician, leader of a new right-wing, some think extreme right-wing party, Forum for Democracy, who tweeted, and for those of you who don't read Dutch, this is my English translation, but seriously, is there anybody who really thought that mass migration of people from a totally different part of the world, with a totally different background, totally different ideas and manners, could give us something? Well, this is a rhetorical question, you understand. So I don't think Thierry Baudet thinks the answer is yes. A second example of his colleague Geert Wilders, leader of the, let's say, competing radical right party, Party for Freedom, who says we are being colonized and our population is being replaced by people with norms that are not ours. Well, this is one of the more moderate things that Geert Wilders has to say, I must say. But here's the theme of, let's say, replacement, omvolking, which is, by the way, has a very strong Nazist roots. So let's say these are two examples, but I mean, these are two right-wing, very right-wing politicians, but also if you look at the center of European politics, social democrats, Christian democrats, it is striking that more and more this kind of discourse is being normalized, and this framework that there is something wrong with migrants and something totally wrong with migration is more and more reproduced also by mainstream political parties. And of course this is nothing new. Everyone who looks at the media can draw this conclusion for him or herself. But what is more important as a historian, to see that it is part of a very negative and dominant discourse that developed already some 30 years ago. And in the book that I wrote with my brother Jan Lucassen, we argue that especially the Rushdie affair at the end of the 1980s played a very crucial role in this transition to a much more negative discourse about migration. And for those of you who were not born or very little in 1989, the Rushdie affair came out of the publication of a book, Satanic Verses, by the English Indian author Salman Rushdie in 1988. And soon this was seen as an insult by very orthodox Muslims, as an insult to Islam, and especially the new regime in Iran with Khomeini at the head immediately condemned the author and sent out a fatwa that any Muslim was entitled to kill the author because of blasphemy. Well, that was okay, that was far away, Stan, so why bother? But soon in 1989, it was the beginning of 1989, when the book was being translated into Dutch, Muslims in the Netherlands, but also in other Western European countries, took to the streets, as you can see here in The Hague, demanding and reiterating the demand of Ayatollah Khomeini that the book should be banned, should be burned. And this came really as a shock to many people, and understandably so. So for many people who thought, okay, we've taken in migrants, and yeah, there are some problems with them, but there was a very communist opinion in the 1980s although there were all kind of social problems, it was a period of recession, economic recession, high unemployment, but interestingly so, the migration and integration was not made into a political issue. So more or less there was an agreed upon consensus among political parties from the left to the right that migrants should not be, let's say, victimized and becoming an electoral issue. You can call this political correctness, you can call this whatever you want, but that was how it was in the 1980s. And this political correctness, or at least this agreement, really was shattered when the Rushdie affair broke out. And just to give you two citations by two leading left-wing intellectuals in the Netherlands, also to show that, let's say, the discomfort with immigration and integration is not something that only came from the right, but also very much was driven by the left as well, which is explained by the fact that the very anti-clerical cultural revolution from the 1960s and 70s, where, let's say, the revolutionaries very much were against religion in general, and Christianity, Catholicism, the church, this was all had to go. And of course, this was also a period in which the Netherlands, but also other Western European countries, experienced a very dramatic and quick transition to a secularized non-Christian society. So this was seen as, let's say, a religion coming back through the back door. So it's not so surprising that, for example, Gerrit Komrij, who was a very famous poet and writer, but really seen as an emblem of the left, would write, "We indulge these unfortunate people, and now they return as wolves." Jan Blokker, who was also a very well-known journalist for the left-wing newspaper, he wrote even much more extreme: "These Muslims are intentional murderers who should be deported per Orient Express." So these are not right-wing politicians, no, they are left-wing intellectuals. So the question for tonight are the following. First of all, how did we get there? Yeah? How did we get here? How did we get in this very polarized, very pessimistic, antagonistic atmosphere when it comes to migration and integration? Secondly, as a scholar, we always have to ask the question, maybe they are right. Are we right to be pessimistic? Are there reasons, are there arguments to find why indeed we should be worrying about what we see happening around us? And thirdly, but I will use a historical method also by comparing periods and by looking at developments over time to answer these questions. Well, when it comes to history, and I will mainly use the Dutch migration history, which is a very interesting one, because the Netherlands from the 16th, 17th century onwards were one of the most developed economies in the world, which attracted large numbers of migrants. And this went on for centuries. So we have a kind of a laboratory situation of which we know the outcome, at least how, let's say, the society reacted to these migrants, what they brought to society. Did they bring something in the 17th century? And then I will ask the question, to what extent is this, let's say, the same kind of situation as we are in today? Because, let's say, arguing that the Netherlands has a long history, 5 centuries of migration is one thing, but that not necessarily means that the developments in the present will take the same kind of road as it did in the past. If you would ask most people who know something about Dutch migration history, but again, you can take other countries as well, you would mostly get this answer. Yes, of course, there were these wonderful migrants in the past, and they were high skilled, they were merchant, they were networked. I mean, they had something to offer, the good migrants. This is this good migrant story about early modern the Netherlands. And then, yeah, today, well, look at them. These are the migrants today. Only troublemakers, people with different cultures who don't want to integrate. So yes, there was migration then, and yes, there's migration now, but these are two worlds completely apart. So this would be an answer that you very likely would get if you would put it into the open. Well, is this warranted? Is this indeed the case? Well, it could be, but in order to know, you really have to look at what we know about then and what we know about now. And that is one of the things that I will do in this lecture. Well, let's first of all look at northwestern Europe, where the Netherlands, as I said, one of the most developed, or the most developed modern economy, marketized economies, and very global as well. First of all, and here you see a map, by the way, drawn by my colleague Jelle van Lottem, in what was happening in the first decades of the 17th century, well known in the Netherlands as the golden century of Rembrandt and a lot of riches. Amsterdam, as you know it, many of the buildings were built in that period. This map shows how intense the migrations in the North Sea area were, both within but also a lot of people leaving the North Sea area, for example, as soldiers and sailors on the fleets of the Dutch East India Company, but I'll return to that in a moment. So this was a very mobile times. And all of you who might have thought that migration is a modern phenomenon that is, let's say, only became relevant with the Industrial Revolution and the transport revolution of steamships and railroads, etc. Well, I have to disappoint you. Migration has been with us for a very long time, if not for the entire human history. But I will not go back 80,000 years, because then we will be here tomorrow morning still. So that is not, I think, what the organizers want me to do. So let me limit myself to the last centuries. Well, this is a crucial century, at least for the Netherlands, but also for other European countries, in which mobility was very high. Okay, so if we compare, so how high was it? Well, there are different ways of measuring this. And one way, which is a bit anachronistic way, but that's one of the few, let's say, ways we can really measure it given the data and the sources that we have, is looking at the percentage of people that were born abroad. So that's, let's say, a definition that is more modern, that is tied up with the nation state, but okay, at least it gives us some idea. So then you get, this is what you get if you take 417 years of migration to the Netherlands, so the share of foreign born in the Netherlands. So what you can see that it was quite high in the early modern period, then it goes down in the 19th century, explained by the fact that the Netherlands did only partially and very late industrialize. So the 19th century was booming with migration in other countries around the Netherlands, including Belgium. And then it gradually increased again, especially in the last 4 decades. And what you then, of course, also see is that the composition of the migrants has changed. Partly people from the colonies have come to the Netherlands, both Indonesia and Suriname, and partly people from other parts of the world. We have to realize, by the way, that let's say what it says, rest non-Europe, which is a kind of, I should change this, this is a very negative kind of definition, I should say the rest of the world, is impractical for 80-90% regions, bordering regions of Europe. So we're talking about Turkey and North Africa, so it's not that far away as you might think. So this already shows that migration has a much longer trajectory than many people think. And if we then look at 4 main Dutch cities, and we look at the share of foreign born in these cities, Amsterdam, Leiden, where I live, The Hague and Rotterdam, then you see that in these in 3 moments in time, so 1600, 1700, 1800, and then the current era, Amsterdam is interesting, where you can see that if you would ask someone from Amsterdam, when do you think were the most people from foreign countries are in Amsterdam? They would of course say, it's now, never been so high. Well, that's not the case. If you look around about 1600, it was 40%. 4 out of 10 were born outside. We're not talking about the second generation here. Leiden, in my hometown, for the last 40 years at least, was more or less taken over by French-speaking, Walloon-speaking migrants from what is now southwestern Belgium, northwestern France, who went there as textile workers, also were invited, by the way, to Leiden to come there. So, talking about omvolking and remplacement, yeah, well, that took place in Leiden around 1600. So there the natives were really in the minority. So this shows how interesting, let's say, history can be, because let's say we've been through this at least one time before. And what can we then learn from this experience? Did people also feel threatened? Did it indeed shake the foundations of society? Well, as I said, most people would argue, no, that's not the case, but that's also understandable, because these were the good migrants. And most of the examples that are given are examples of refugees, and well-connected and also highly educated refugees with capital, and both financial and human capital. So the Sephardim, Jews who were forced to convert in Spain and in Portugal, but who did want to become Jew again, they fled to those areas of Europe where they could practice their religion openly. And there were only 2 places, basically, where they were more or less free to be Jews again. And that was the Dutch Republic. And it was the Ottoman Empire. By far, most of the Iberian Jews went to southeastern Europe and to what is now Turkey, because the Ottomans were quite tolerant in this respect. But very few of them, a few thousands, left for Amsterdam and built this synagogue, which you can still see in the center of town at the Waterlooplein. And they became very famous. They were well-connected merchants, who were, let's say, very well known in the southern part of the Atlantic, so the trade between Europe, West Africa, and South America. And then, essentially, also later, a lot of people from France came, the French Protestants, the Huguenots, who also were put for the question either to convert or, well, face the consequences. Most of these Huguenots, by the way, converted, at least nominally, but 1 out of 10 left France, so a few hundred thousands and 50,000 of them ended up in the Dutch Republic. So this would, let's say, more or less confirm the idea of the good migrants. I mean, these were migrants everyone wants. I mean, they're well-educated, they have money, they don't make trouble. And they had, of course, the right, at least the Huguenots had the right religion, they were also Protestant. The Jews were a problem because of their religion, and they were also second-rate citizens, but these Jews at least had a lot of capital, and well, that is always a good thing, at least in the Netherlands, I can tell you. So, but how representative are these groups, and I could mention even more of these refugees, but how representative are they for, let's say, the migrants in early modern Europe and also in early modern the Netherlands? Well, as you can see, and this is a calculation of the origin of people who moved to cities in what is now North and South Holland in the Netherlands. And then you can see that at least half of them came from abroad. So this is a huge share of the total immigration into cities. But from that share, only 25%, let's say, were the refugees, the well-educated refugees. 3 out of 4 did not belong to this category, but were, let's say, low or medium skilled labor migrants from Scandinavia, from German states, and from Switzerland, which by then was not that rich Switzerland as we know now, but a very poor country, and also from France and what is now Belgium. And then we have to think of, let's say, people who came to the Netherlands and to Dutch cities in order to do work that most of the Dutch workers were not willing to do. This is a picture of a suikerbakker, a sugar baker. I'm not sure if that's the right translation. I should have looked that up. A suikerbakker this is not a baker itself. This was a very heavy occupation. The refining raw sugar that came from Brazil at that time. So there were 60 of these very filthy sugar mills in the center of Amsterdam, where sugar had to be heated in order to be refined. This was very heavy work, and most of the workers were German or Scandinavian migrants. So let's say most of the migrants were not these high-skilled, wonderful, good migrants, but were, let's say, migrants who were more at the lower ends of the urban society. Many of them ended up in the proletariat of these cities. And of course also the issue that is now often discussed, that, let's say, criminality is increasing due to immigration. Well, also that is nothing new. Here is a well-known example of a Scandinavian woman of 20 years old who arrived in Amsterdam in 1664. Her name is Elsje Christiaans. She came from Jutland and now in Denmark. And Elsje Christiaans, as many other poor migrants, hoped to find a job in booming Amsterdam. For some reason, this did not work out, and after 3 weeks, her landlady said, "Well, Elsje, where's the rent?" And they got into a fight because Elsje didn't have any penny, and so things got nasty. And at some moment, Elsje saw this axe lying and just hit the head of her landlady, and she immediately died. Elsje fled, but was soon apprehended, convicted, and brought to death. And here, this is a wonderful picture by Rembrandt of Elsje hanging at the gallows at the other side of the central station in Amsterdam. For those of you who've ever been there, at the back side of the station, you take a ferry, and that's where, let's say, the condemned and the gallows were. So this is this is a good example of a migrant gone wrong, you could say, and she was by far not the only one. So this rosy picture of wonderful migration and wonderful good migrants in early modern period should at least be nuanced. Well, who more did come? Not only people came to settle in cities and to do work in cities, but also a lot of migrants who only came temporarily to do seasonal work. And this was for the Netherlands, but also other parts of Europe. And here you see an overview, and every circle that you see means 10,000 people. So there were various seasonal systems in Western and Southern Europe, especially, well, look at Italy, for example. So these were people needed to do the harvest, especially, who were not there in the harvest areas themselves. So each year, hundreds of thousands of people took to the roads and often walked for hundreds of kilometers to do the harvest in the areas where the agriculture was concentrated, especially highly commercial agriculture was concentrated. So it's comparable with Eastern Europeans now coming to Western Europe to pick strawberries, etc. In essence, the same kind of system. And for the Netherlands, this, although you only see 3 circles, so we're talking about 25 to 30,000 people each year who came in the spring and left in the fall. But then you have to realize there were only living maybe 1 million people at that time in the coastal area of the Netherlands. So this was quite an impact. But they were indispensable because otherwise the agriculture had a big problem. They also built the dikes. They would dig peat. For all kind of activities where there was no local offer. So again, it's comparable with a lot of work that Romanians and Poles and Bulgarians are doing at at this moment. So mostly men. Again, in here you see 3 of them on their way from Germany to the Netherlands. Again, Germany was not the Germany of Mercedes-Benz and Audi and Miele. That Germany was also a very poor area. So everyone came to this very rich part, which was then called the Dutch Republic. So this is a second type of migration, which was absolutely necessary to keep this Dutch miracle going. A third type were sailors and soldiers who were recruited by the Dutch East India Company. Well, this was also a problem because, let's say, the Dutch Republic had huge ambitions to sail the oceans and to reap the advantages of let's say, colonies in both in the east and in the west. So they needed a lot of people to man the ships, but also to man the fortresses over there and to defend their economic interests. So between 1600 and 1800, some 1 million people took to the sea from Dutch harbors. So the same number as, let's say, the population of the Netherlands in this period. Half of them, again, came from abroad. Again, this was not that strange, first of all, because, let's say, of the limited inhabitants in the Netherlands themselves, but also because this was not a very, let's say, this was a job you had to think at least 3 times before you joined the VOC. 1 in 3 did not come back alive. They would die from diseases. So that was kind of a Russian roulette, although that's 1 in 6, I think. So this was an extreme Russian roulette. But if you didn't have any other options, well, then you could you could go to these offices of the Dutch East India Company. You see 2 pictures, one of Amsterdam and one in Rotterdam. So here's a nice picture again from Jelle van Lottem, who has put all these people into a database and then with a GIS method has mapped, let's say, where they are from. Yeah, so half of them from the area, the territory of the Dutch Republic, but the rest from outside. Also this was, let's say, a offer of labor migrants without which let's say, all these global ambitions of the Dutch Republic would not have been possible. So we are talking here about mass migration for at least 2 centuries, without which there would not have been a golden century, without which the Netherlands would have looked now very different than it does today. Well, then the question, what did people think of this? So what did the native Dutch, I mean, I can now explain to you that it was good for the economy, but well, they had to live with these people who spoke a different language, sometimes had a different religion, and so who had to adapt to a constantly, a society which was constantly in flux. Well, first of all, it's not so easy to reconstruct the public opinion. First of all, because it was not a democracy. There were no politicians who could say, well, we should ban these foreigners, etc. I mean, these were the elites in towns who would decide whether migrants were welcome or not. And these elites were also the capitalists and had an interest in recruiting migrants. That's to start with. And that is also makes the situation different from today, where you have a very, let's say, polarized political circus, as we can see from day in, day out. So that is one. But if you look at, we have some sources that at least tell us something about the image that people had about foreigners, and this was, you could say, mild. That this was making fun of foreigners more than hating foreigners. Yeah, so all kind of theatrical plays about the Germans, who were called Poepen or Moffen at that time, and so there was that the theme was always the same. So it was, we would make fun of the foreigners, especially of the Germans, because they were very stupid. Of course, you understand. Drank too much, easy to trick, etc. So you have this wonderful, let's say, a number of plays, and we also have been reconstructed how many people must have seen these plays. So this was quite wide distributed. But it's interesting to see that let's say the very vicious apocalyptical tone that I started my lecture with is totally lacking in this kind of. So I think you can say that yes, there were some tensions, but not with most of the migrants, except one group. These are not Muslims. These are Orthodox Jews from what is now Poland, Ukraine, White Russia, who came in much larger numbers than these wonderful Sephardim from Spain. So we're talking about the 50 or 60,000 who settled in the Dutch Republic, especially in Amsterdam, in the mid-17th century. Jews could never become full citizens. They were second-rate citizens. They could not enter most of the jobs. They were excluded from most of the guilds. Most of them were quite orthodox, as you can see here, with their hats and the long gowns. And from the Jews, we know that they were really, let's say, partly hated and also harassed in the streets. I mean, this is an even more extreme, I would say even much more extreme kind of stigmatization than we see now with Muslims and Islamophobia. So not all was well in the Republic of the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th century. So there was and the mechanism that we see when it comes to anti-Semitism and the Jews is also an interesting mechanism if it comes to let's say how certain groups in the present are being targeted. So it's, let's say, if we then go back to our question, are the integration pessimists right, and what can historical comparisons teach us? Then I think this picture no longer holds. It's much more, and one of the problems with this picture is not only that it tends to limit itself to, let's say, the good migrants and forget about all the others, but also that when it comes to the present, that it very much tends to limit the discussion on migration on very specific groups. Groups that for some reason are seen as a problem. We are not talking in the Netherlands or in Belgium about most European migrants within our borders, or Japanese, or Americans, or high-skilled migrants in general. We have even thought of a different category for them. We call them expats. It's a kind of a racialization of migration, if you think of it. So the comparison is very much skewed. For the past we look at the good migrants, for the present at the bad. Well, who will win? This is an easy game. But if you really want to have a balanced picture of what migration is and what it does to our societies, well, then at least you have to balance the picture and also look at what we could call the good migrants, again, between parentheses, at the present, and also, let's say, the shadow sides of migration, in the first place for the migrants themselves, I should add, in the past. So I think that this idea of that the past is very different from the present when it comes to the type of migrants and also what they add to our societies, is that there are many more similarities than most people would realize. And it has very much to do with the kind of discourse that we are used to. That migration, if you say, well, what about Belgians in the Netherlands? We don't mean the Belgians, they're not migrants. So migrants has become, let's say, a term that is only used for people that people don't like. Yeah. So, and migration, by that matter, has become a phenomenon, like as if it's an illness. Yeah, and so that you have to fight against. If you look at the rhetoric, also at the EU level, about, let's say, fighting the roots of migration. I mean, this also gives the strong impression that migration is something we should all try to prevent, because migration is a bad thing. Well, there's a very curious kind of approach, because if you then, if you realize that many people do migrate, including ourselves, I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Dutch and Belgians who leave their country each year to explore the world, to study somewhere else, and to work for international companies or whatever, or settle for good. But these are all, let's say, excluded from the discussion. So this becomes very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as a historian, as an academic, I would say if you really want to understand and also to map and deeply understand what the role of migration in our societies is, we have to look at the full picture. So this leads me to my last question: how did we get here? So how did we get in this situation, both in Belgium, in France, in Germany, and in the Netherlands, or in Denmark, where I was earlier this week, and with populists in the government? How did we get in this very poisonous atmosphere where it comes to migration and migrants? Well, then of course we have to realize that there is one big difference with the early modern period, and this is what James Holyfield, a political scientist from the US, calls, from the late 19th and early 20th century, what we see arising is what he calls a migration state, which means the state has become the arena to decide who can enter and who can't, and who is welcome and who isn't, and is also has become a democratic arena. I already mentioned it. There was no democracy in 17th century Amsterdam. There is democracy now. And this also means that, let's say, politicians can use migration in order to recruit voters, and also can use all kind of stigmatizing mechanisms to recruit voters. Well, what Holyfield argues in his migration state concept, that in liberal democracies, because that's where this he does apply this concept to, there are at least 4 dimensions that influence. So the blue is the arena that influences the arena, and also the public discourse with respect to migration. So there are markets or economic interests, mostly quite positive when it comes to migration, because, well, let's say employers need workers. Then there is a dimension of rights, especially in liberal democracies. After World War II, migrants have also become bearers of rights, which also means that they have a right to come, to stay, and also to become full citizens of these societies. But then there are 2 other dimensions which often work in a more negative way. One is security. So there can be issues about, let's say, think of terrorism, when states might be more hesitant in accepting migrants. Well, look at Trump's America now. And especially, and that's, I think, a very interesting dimension of culture. There can be all kinds of cultural fears when it comes to migrants. Well, think of the citation of Thierry Baudet that I gave at the beginning. Well, so let's say this makes it partly a different ball game, you could say, a different kind of arena in the 20th century. And, well, one of the first groups that were confronted with this new discourse, with this new arena, were Jewish refugees in the 1930s, who were, let's say, trying to flee Nazism, but had a very difficult time being accepted in their neighboring countries, whether it was the Netherlands, whether Belgium or France, or England for that matter, or the US. Most of these countries did not want Jewish refugees. And this had to do with a virulent anti-Semitism, and also a very strong nationalism, which led to a kind of migration pessimism when it came to these apparent refugees, and often people were not only stopped at the border, but so often in the Netherlands are many cases when they had passed the border sent back to Nazi Germany, even after Kristallnacht in November 1939. So this is the kind of a first very direct example of where, let's say, this new constellation of what Holyfield calls the migration state, where culture and security at that moment were dominating and not so much rights and markets. Well, that leads me to the last part of my lecture, which has to do with our current time, especially the post-World War II period. And I'm doing this, before I go into it, I have to explain a little that when you ask a historian, a migration historian especially, to, let's say, reflect upon migration now and then, many would tend to say, and I'm one of them, well, we've seen it all before. I mean, migration is nothing new. Yes, there may be tensions, there may be problems, but over time, over generations, things will settle, so no problem in the end. And I think, to a large extent, that is also true. The question is whether people want to be so patient to wait for the second or the third generation for things to settle, but that's another issue. But it's also an answer that is too easy, because it neglects that certain things, especially after World War II, have changed, not only, let's say, the discourse as Holyfield sketches in his migration state, but also three developments which also changed the migration dynamic. And you could say that until the Second World War, and at least until the 20th century, migration was primarily driven by economic considerations, by labor markets. So booming economies would attract migrants, and when economies would go down, look at the circle of the graph that I showed for the Netherlands, then migrants will stay at home or will go somewhere else. The refugees were part of the puzzle also then, but they did not have any right as refugee to be accepted. Also they reacted to economic stimuli as well. After World War II, there are at least, and that's why I would call it a regime change, at least three developments that made things at least partly different. You see here a picture of the Geneva Convention, 1951, the Refugee Convention, that is still with us today, although de facto it has been neutralized to a large extent, I would argue. But just as an example. So what are these three developments that changed the dynamics? One is decolonization. So because of the decolonization of European colonies, for political reasons, large numbers of people did enter Western Europe. You can look at the UK, from the West Indies, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Netherlands from Suriname and Indonesia, Belgium, of course, a very limited number from the Belgium Congo, Portugal from Mozambique and Angola, and so on and so on. So these were migrants who would not necessarily come for, let's say, not primarily come for economic reasons, but whose migration would be very much triggered by political developments. And sometimes they came at the right economic moment, like the people from Indonesia, the beginning of Les Trente Glorieuses, at the beginning of the 1950s, but the Surinamese came in the mid-70s when a long economic recession set in. So this is one, let's say, which made things different. A second is then, I already showed you the 1951 picture, what I could, not I, others have called the humanitarian turn. This very much has to do with the impact of the Second World War, has to do with the establishment of the United Nations, of UNESCO, of indeed the Refugee Convention. And also, so this made it possible for people to apply for asylum. And also this was not necessarily driven by economic considerations, but very much by the conflicts in various areas of the world. They determined, like the conflict in Syria very recently, so the Syrians did not en masse leave Syria because they thought, hey, I can have a job in Germany, but they did it primarily because of the Assad regime. Of course, in second instance, they would think you would be mad if you wouldn't. Well, if I have to flee, where would I go and where could I work? I mean, so economic considerations are always part of it, but not the primary reason. So also refugee migrations have changed the very economic dimension of migration. And then thirdly, guest workers and the welfare state. Well, guest workers who came from the 1950s onwards, first from Southern Europe, then from Northern Africa, Turkey. At first, this would, let's say, this was the old economic rationale. They came because there was a lot of work for them. But then they stayed and got their families at a moment when the economy was going down. And this, nobody had expected this, not in the least the guest workers themselves, but it was a consequence of the fact that they not only entered the territory of Western European states, but also entered the social security system for which they paid premiums, etc. So at the moment that these states gave the message, we are stopping the recruitment and we close the borders, the totally unexpected effect was that many of these guest workers realized that if they would leave, they would never be let back in, and all the rights that they had built in the system and paid for themselves would be gone. So this, let's say the welfare state, and nobody had foreseen this, had a very adverse effect on, let's say, the migration pattern. So what you then see is that many of these people who were selected for low skills or no skills at all, they had to start their integration process at the beginning of a long recession in the worst parts of towns, with most of the male breadwinners losing their jobs. So that this would lead to a lot of social and also cultural problems, not in the least for the migrants themselves, is not higher physics, you could say. So, so these three developments did create, let's say, a different kind of dynamic and also a different kind of atmosphere. So the question, how did we get here and why are we talking so differently about migrants and migration than we did, for example, in an earlier phase of mass migration in early modern Europe, has also very much to do with, well, basically with the two factors. One, the nation state and the migration state, as Holyfield, with these new kind of interests and a new kind of arena, political arena. And secondly, with a different migration dynamic after World War II. And this brings me to, well, here, this is a scheme from an article I did in Ethnic and Racial Studies, which was to explain why we are talking so apocalyptical about the refugees. So this was at the height of the refugee crisis, but you could, let's say, broaden this to the whole migration debate more in general. And what the argument in this scheme is that if you want to understand, let's say, here it says refugee crisis, but we could also, let's say, make it broader and say, let's say, the anti-migration or integration pessimism, that this came about through, let's say, the interlinking of a number of different developments. One is, which were brought together in a skillful way, I must admit, by right-wing populist leaders and parties who would link, let's say, these different developments. One is a growing inequality in Western Europe, but also in Northern America from the 1980s onwards. So this is an autonomous kind of development where parts of the working class have been worse off. I mean, this has to do with neoliberalism. I don't have to explain that in this audience, I guess. So this was a thing that has been with us already from the early 1980s onwards, but was, let's say, that only became very inflammable, you could say, in recent times. The second development was what I call here the discomfort with integration. So which is partly explained by, you could say, the wrong timing, for example, of the settlement of the families of the guest workers, wrong in economic terms, and which would get a very vicious cultural and anti-religious angle with the Rushdie affair from the 1990s onwards. And that's the third development, the problematization of Islam. The interesting thing is that in the 1990s, when there was a boom of refugees, even higher than it is now, but we've all forgotten that in the 1990s, these developments were not linked to the refugees, also not to many refugees who came from the Middle East. Yes, there was discussion about asylum seekers, but let's say also then it was agreed we are not making this into an electoral issue, there were no real political parties who, let's say, would use these elements in order to target refugees. That changed, and then I think terrorism has played a big role, 9/11 and all the attacks that we have seen since. This was a moment in which populist parties, the Front National, but also the PVV in the Netherlands, were skillfully tying together all these different kinds of developments which had already been with us for quite a while, and linking, let's say, refugees, especially Muslim refugees, or we should say refugees from Islamic countries, or not necessarily Muslims, all together. So in arguing that inequality could be solved by stopping immigration. So because to whom do we give this house? Do we give it to our own natives or to a refugee? So these kind of simple trade-offs were then presented to the voters. The whole discussion about integration problems of Moroccans and Turks, etc., immediately linked to refugees. The whole problematization of Islam was linked to refugees. And this was even made more visible by the fact that refugees, very different from the 1990s, came by boats. Whereas in the 1990s they could, in a normal way, reach Europe. Due to a very strict visa regulation in the last 10 or 15 years, they had to take resource to, let's say, these illegal, irregular traffickers with boats over the Mediterranean, which made it into a very visible phenomenon. And this all led to what we then call the refugee crisis, which is much more a political crisis, I would argue. But this all together, let's say, made the current discourse, although if you look at how the integration process of most of the migrants, including those from Morocco and from Turkey, how this develops over time, well, we should be much more optimistic. I mean, we know a lot about these, but the trends are all upwards. Although the start was so unfortunate at the beginning of the 1980s, but this has totally been forgotten and out of the discussion, and totally, let's say, overwhelmed by these Islamophobic and anti-immigrant discourse that I started my lecture with. It is, by the way, interesting to see that these three elements that changed the dynamic in the post-World War II period, most of them are either disappeared or have been neutralized. There will be no more migrants from the colonies. I mean, decolonization is a finished process. The welfare state has been made very much migration-proof. So migrants very, very gradually and slowly only can build their rights. And when it comes to the refugee convention, well, we can now see that the EU is doing everything to make it even impossible for asylum seekers to reach the territory of Europe in order to hand in an application for asylums. We're externalizing our borders. We are making deals with all kinds of authoritarian regimes. So de facto, the Refugee Convention of 1951 has been neutralized, I would say. So in that sense, whether we like it or not, we are much more back in, when it comes to migration dynamics, much more back in the situation that we were before the 20th century. But this interlude has led to a lot of turbulence and to the situation that I have sketched in my lecture. Let me finish by a book I've been reading in the train coming up here this morning, Julien Benda, La Trahison des Clercs. and clerks should be read here as intellectuals. And this is very much about the role of academics also in the public debate. So this is partly about myself, you could say. But I found it reassuring that Benda, already in 1927, where he was very worried about the fact that many intellectuals did not take this role and that they betrayed their role. That's la trahison des clercs. And he says what intellectuals and academics should do, and we're now talking about migration, but you can talk about other things as well, is not uncritically reproducing prevailing frames, whether they're nationalist or different kind of frames. No, academics should always strive for something else. They should be critical, especially critical about the prevailing frames themselves. And then I found a nice citation when he says, une humanité qui se livre au réalisme, and with realism he means the prevailing frame, avec une unanimité, une absence de réserve, une sanctification de sa passion dont l'histoire n'avait point donné d'exemple. This is what we should not do. And I think, and there are just in the Netherlands a new translation into Dutch with a long forward by Thijs Klein-Paste has been published, in which also the Klein-Paste stresses the relevance of Julien Benda's La Trahison des Clercs for our current times. Well, one of the things that academics can do is give lectures like I have done here tonight. They can write books, as I have done with my brother Jan Lucassen. What I also find a very interesting podium or platform is Twitter. So I've been using this now for 4 years, especially well, to engage into debates, but especially to stress, also to disseminate facts and links to, let's say, useful stuff to read. And I think that is, although it's a very polarized platform, those of you who are on Twitter will know, and I'm being killed at Twitter every day by my opponents, but okay, let them do it. It is one way of trying to reach people outside. And one of the, I often get the argument, well, you're only talking within your bubble. So everyone is in his bubble, so nothing changes. Well, I don't think this is true. We should not underestimate that most people are very open for facts, for nuance. Most people are. But we have to give them these facts. We have to give them these insights. And, well, I think that's one of the things that I've been trying to do over the last years. And that's where I would like to leave it. Thank you very much. And of course, buy our book. That's, of course, I had to say that for my publisher.
Okay, thank you very much. There is time for questions from the audience. I think various issues that you might want to connect to. There are also, I think, 2 microphones. Okay, so we have 1 question there. I suggest we first take 2, 3 questions, and then give you opportunity to respond. So there's one there, there's one here, and there's one there.
Thank you, Professor, for the very stimulating discussion tonight. So I'm Dominic Crucides from the Foundation for Governance and Sustainability, focused in Brussels. And one of the, let's say, main things we say is that globalization is no place for everybody. Globalization may work for us in Brussels, but it doesn't work for lots of people, especially the people that they don't live in the urban areas of Europe. And therefore, I think that this has to do a lot actually about what people think about migration today. That's because they find no place of themselves within the globalized world, and because we have focused so much on economy and all that much on global citizen education and what is our part in this world. So therefore my question would be, would globalization and what comes with it, so global economic crisis and identity crisis that comes with it, would fit into the
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. I'm glad you asked, because it also allows me to, well, you can only say so much in a lecture, and you have to concentrate on certain things. The undertitle of the book is A Story of Winners and Losers. So we do address this issue. And the losers may be some of the migrants themselves, who are disappointed at what happens after migration, and maybe natives who are confronted with the presence of migrants in their country or in their neighborhood, for example. So yes, globalization it makes a very important part of the story, and I think what we should not be, let's say be too taken by the neoliberal enthusiasm for this bright new world where everyone is mobile and can do whatever he and she likes. This great time of freedom, but that we also should be very critical about, let's say, the negative effects, and not so much the negative of migrants themselves, but much more of, let's say, especially employers in the EU, where we have freedom of migration, who often take advantage of migrants and then create, let's say, not a level playing field where they underpay them, which then has consequences for the wage level of native workers themselves, for example. So there are all kinds of, let's say, aspects of our society, especially of when it comes to globalization, that, let's say, should be addressed. But they should be addressed in the right framework. I think that we should be very critical about, let's say, neoliberalism and precarization as such. But not the easy way, as radical populists do, that let's say the cause of these problems are the migrants. Because if you now would send all the migrants away, people will not have a better life. Those, let's say, the natives who stay, because the position that many of them are in is not a consequence of this immigration, but is a consequence of a neoliberalization of society in the last 30 or 40 years, and also breaking down lots of what we were so proud of when it comes to the welfare state. And that is a story that politicians should bring. And this is a slightly more difficult, although again this is also no higher physics story than the foreigners are to blame. But I think that you can be a very successful politician when you lay this on the table and say, okay, and how are we going to address this? Not only by focusing on migration or certain migrants, but by focusing on what kind of society do we want, all of us. And that, let's say, that's an exercise that, of course, takes more intellectual force and also guts than just blaming the migrants. I hope that is some kind of an answer to your question. But yeah, and let me just add, and this makes it also too easy to, let's say, to say that all the people who would vote for Philip de Winter or Geert Wilders, that they are all racist. I mean, yes, some of them are, but many people also vote for these parties because they have been put in a very difficult position, but I would say by the mainstream politicians in the last 30 years.
Good evening, thank you for your talk. So we're students from BOZAR, actually, social sciences. So my question is, you talked about how actually integration and the problems with immigration, the idea is that over time it would split itself out and people would eventually get to the point where they accept the foreigners. What I'm curious about, how do you think, like, how much do you think actually with race, and not in an abstract form, but a very visible, very physical attributes of race factor into the problems of race? Because when I look around myself, I'm from Turkey, and then because of the way I look, I can get a very different treatment from people, and then it's not just the fact that I am different, but also I also have a very lighter, view of skin. And how much do you think that people can get over the fact that not just the abstract concept of race, but the looks can be someone from, for example, North Africa or Central Africa with a different look and integrate their society?
Yeah, well, that absolutely plays a role, but that's nothing revolutionary to say, of course. But it's not only phenotype, I would say. I mean, it doesn't help if you have a different color, if you look differently in many circumstances. But it's only one of the elements, I think, of what a broader process of racialization. Because it also includes, let's say, dress. If you look at Islam, let's say the Islamophobia that has been growing since the 1990s. This is not only about phenotype. I mean, also everyone who would wear a hijab will be discriminated against. And because many people have essentialized Muslims, and in that sense racialized Muslims, however they may look as white as they want, and that's very similar, I think, with racial anti-Semitism that emerged at the end of the 19th century, where it was believed that you could recognize Jews, although most people, of course, could not. But it was also believed that Jews as a people and as a culture could not really change. And of course that's also very strong, again, if you look at the reactions of many of my tweets from, let's say, concerned citizens, I shall call them, there is a very vicious racialized and Islamophobia, which goes beyond phenotype simply. So that would be one, let's say, a remark. A second remark is that phenotype also depends. It depends on the association that people have. And colonial migrants here are an interesting example. Colonial migrants, although they may look much more different than Turks in the Netherlands, often have an easier type if they are recognized as colonial migrants. I'm not saying that there's no racism against Surinamese. There is. Look at the Zwarte Piet or the Black Piet discussion that we now have. But if you would ask most Dutch, also the concerned citizens, whom they would like to hang out with, a Turk or a Suriname, or a Creole Surinamese, or those who were being sent, who were enslaved Africans taken to the colony in Suriname, the Surinamese would win. Because they identify easier, because they don't have this funny religion. They speak, they have been socialized in Dutch language and Dutch culture already in the colony before they came. So there you see that sometimes, let's say, in this case, other things can trump race as well. And this is a story which I've always tried to explain to my American colleagues who really don't get it. I mean, for them, color is so essential, and of course, in the United States, it is, because of the internal slavery tradition in the U.S. This has been so, let's say, has become so ingrained in the American culture. It's very difficult to look beyond color in an American context. In Western European colonial states, I think this is slightly different, and may then also lead to these different kinds of elements. Yeah, and again, also class does play a role. Let's say if you're in a nice suit and if you speak impeccable Flemish or Dutch, you can still be discriminated against, but the chances go down. Yeah, so it's so that it's an interplay of different kinds of factors, I would say. But obviously, race and racialization play an important role. And I'm sorry, and I'm very. It's disconcerting to see that it has picked up again. I mean, we have this silly discussion about IQ of racists in the Netherlands not too long ago by the same Thierry Baudet, and mainstream media who then publish things, well, maybe there's something in it, and there are some academics who say, yes, Africans have a lower IQ than, I mean, I thought we had left this behind us, and I mean, there's overwhelming academic evidence that it's all bullshit, but the fact that this has become a serious topic again, well, shows that although I'm a very optimistic man, well, there is, let's say, a backlash there going on as well, and we'll have to see where this ends. Yeah.
You said that the decolonization process is finished. What do you mean by it? Like, would you say that colonialism has actually finished, or would you just say that decolonization?
Well, yeah, let me qualify that. What I mean by decolonization was one moment in time. Yeah? There's only, let's say, at one date, a certain country would be decolonized and become its own, its own separate from the former colonizer. So in Indonesia, this happened in 1949, in Suriname in 1975. Well, we know all the days. Most of the countries in Africa and Asia decolonized between 1950 and 1965. So these were moments at which, let's say, certain segments of the population could have a hard time. Because they were seen as traitors, as having collaborated with the former colonizer. In the Dutch East Indies, these were the mixed group of often Indonesian mothers and Dutch fathers, so the Indos, the Eurasians. So they were seen as part of the hated colonizer, and so they had a very difficult time, and many of them then also migrated to the land of the former colonizer. So these are, let's say, moments that are that you can really see in time, and these were also windows of opportunities for certain people from the colonies to take advantage of legislation. Well, many people from India, from Pakistan, also from East. So let's say the Indians who were living in East Africa, Uganda, for example, and from the West Indies in the 1950s until the early 60s, when the legislation became much more severe, took this window of opportunity in order to migrate to Europe. Well, these moments are over, these possibilities are over. So I'm not arguing that nobody from these colonies comes anymore. Yes, of course, if they can get a visa, and I mean, still people are coming from Indonesia to the Netherlands, also from Suriname, but there is no open access anymore, and there will be no, let's say, very sudden movements of large numbers of people for this reason. That's what I meant by the... Is that clear? Or... Yeah? Not entirely, I see, but...
No, it's
Okay.
okay.
My name is Shantu, and I'm from Ceylon, a Dutch colony, but my parents left because of the war in Sri Lanka. And I'm living in Belgium now for the last 5 years, trying to integrate myself. And my question is, what are the strong steps as a city, democratically or politically speaking, which can be taken so that a city can basically stand up for it? Because I think every city has its own, as we saw, many cities have their own migration crisis. And as we're reaching closer, as we said many times, to a post-apocalyptic era, where climate change and many other things are going to bring more people from various parts in, and then you have fascism rising, Trump, Bolsonaro, and also in Flanders. So my question is, what is the best political structure or a city-wide policy, or like steps which we can take? Because it's nice, the theory is interesting, but what do we do as citizens? Thank you.
Very, very, very good question. Because cities are, let's say, the arena where these things play out. And it's very interesting to see that at, let's say, well, in Flanders it's now a little bit different, but let's say the most extreme apocalyptical kind of discussions and discourses that we have are not at the city level so much. They're at the national level, where there are not so many consequences. But if a mayor of a city would say what Baudet or Wilders or Philip de Winter says, well, he immediately has a problem, because he has to deal with these people in his or her direct environment. And that's why cities are incredibly important and also often diverge from national policies when it comes to integrating, well, the entire population, I would say, not only those who come from afar. And you see that also cities are often much better at it than national politicians are. And it has also just to do with interests and also with a different position. And I find that I've given many lectures also during the refugee crisis, and very often that it doesn't really matter from what political faction a mayor is. They all agree that we should talk in a sensible and moderate way about migration and integration, because that's the only option they have. Well, what's this guy Somers from Mechelen, this liberal mayor of Mechelen, who in an interview recently, I think he's a liberal, I mean, he's a bit right-wing liberal, but a real liberal in the sense that he is really against this polarizing kind of discourse, and he has a very inclusive kind of philosophy. Yeah, whether it really works on the ground, I mean, I cannot judge, but this is a very different take on, let's say, this whole public debate than often national politicians do, and also the national media do. So I think cities is where it will have to happen, and where, well, we as citizens, I guess that most of us in this are living in a city. That's the arena that we are in, find ourselves in as well. So, and it's interesting also from a historical perspective that also then it was an urban issue. Right? These were things that were really decided and played out at the urban level. And also there we can learn quite a bit from historical examples.
I hear a lot of politicians saying there's an increase of illegal migration and that is the big problem we should focus on. How do you respond to that?
Well, my first response would be, how do they know that there's an increase? I would, by the way, not use the word illegal. I know that politicians like to do this, but I don't think people can be illegal. You could say irregular, people who are undocumented or don't have the right papers in order to stay in a certain area. Whether that has increased is not so simple, because per definition we do not know, because they're not registered. Yeah, so. But of course, it's a way to raise certain political awareness and that let's say as a legitimization to act in a political way. In general, I think it very much depends on what country in Europe we're looking at. To what extent there is an opportunity structure for irregular migration. Let's say the UK, and that's one of the reasons why so many migrants who don't get a visa to enter the EU want to go to the UK, because there's a much larger informal labor market where you can get a job and earn money without the right papers. In Germany or in the Netherlands, and I'm sure also for Belgium, this is much more difficult because we have very bureaucratized and formalized societies. Southern Europe, again, a big labor market, especially, well, look at the tomatoes in southern Italy. I mean, they drive on irregular migrants. Without them, we wouldn't eat any tomatoes anymore. And so it very much depends on, let's say, the economic and political opportunity structure and whether irregular migrants can also make a living. Because if you can't, I mean, then you're totally dependent on people who would like to give you something, or networks or co-ethnics who do have a regular status. I mean, this is a limited niche. The idea that there are millions and millions of irregular migrants in Europe really should be taken with a pinch of salt. And I think you really have to ask the question, how do you know? And so where does it then and to what extent is it also the result of our own legislation to start with? Yeah, because we make it so difficult, let's say, for a number of migrants to enter, that we also producing irregularity ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Leo. I think we have time for one last question. Okay, you already have. Okay, then I have two last questions. I suggest we just have them one after the other, and then we will to respond. Do you have very last questions?
Thank you for your very informative lecture. I learned a lot. I'm wondering why there's this public perception that migration is so easy to accomplish in the EU. I've noticed that if you look at a lot of the news, then there's this idea that it's very easy for people to migrate through Europe. And I'm wondering how that's come about, that idea, when it's actually harder than ever.
Yeah. Well, partly because a lot of people are saying this. Yeah, sorry?
Okay, I was suggesting to prove the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good. That's okay. Yeah.
If we're looking at, for instance, a good example here from the 17th century where people migrated to the Netherlands, race may have less been involved, but religion may have been involved to some extent. Those migrants at some point may have become anti-migrants. This is something that we may have also seen in the past century with Italians and other countries still within Europe migrating to Belgium, Netherlands, and so on. Is this something that we can also expect from the current migrants living already here, that they may at some point also become anti-migrants to some extent, or
become what?
Anti-migrants.
Anti-migrants. Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm doing these two, or you want to take more? Okay. Well, to start with the first question. The idea that, let's say, that the borders are open and that we're out of control, this is a message that many politicians like to give, and some of them even believe in it, is, I think, wrong. To start with, people do underestimate, let's say, the paper border that we have created is much more important than all the gates in Ceuta, Melilla, or wherever which are very spectacular, where people try to climb the gates and to enter Fortress Europe. Much more effective is our visa system. And that has been built since the early 1990s gradually, which means that you only can reach Europe or the EU member state in a normal way, that is to say by airplane or by ferry or by bus or by whatever, if you have this visa in your passport. If you don't have it, then let's say the journey becomes quite risky and very expensive. Yeah. So then you are subject to very lousy entrepreneurs who will charge you thousands of euros in a lousy means of transportation, mostly a boat that is leaking. So, I mean, you only take the second option if you really, really are very motivated for whatever reason, either because you really have to flee or because your family has said that you really have to go to earn money for the family and go to Europe. So and if you look at the numbers, let's say, of people who try to reach Europe in this more irregular way, these are not that large numbers. Everyone is thinking about this 1 million in 2015, but if you look, let's say, at the longer durée, the last 30 years, we're talking about maybe 250,000 people on a population of more than 500 million per year. So this visa system works quite well when it comes to regulating people entering Europe. And everyone forgets, for example, that at least 10 times as many people from Africa come by airplane with a visa in their passport, and only 1 in 10, let's say, takes these highly risky travel across the Mediterranean. So there's a very skewed image of, let's say, how the migration process really takes place in the EU. Can migrants become anti-migrants? Yes, of course, and many of them do. Surinamese, for example, in the Netherlands, who were, let's say, the scapegoat in the 1970s and 1980s, then the populace said, well, these will never become Dutch because they're black and because they have this very different culture. They will never be able to assimilate. Well, now almost nobody talks about them anymore. And part of them now vote for Geert Wilders because they think, oh, these Muslims. I mean, so, and it's also a way to distance yourself and to, let's say, to make, and hoping that, let's say, it's like being bullied at school. I mean, the greatest bulliers are those who are afraid to be bullied. And I think that's the same mechanism that you often see with, let's say, former or previous migrants and the latest arrivals.
This is also something we can see with Muslim migrants?
Well, I think in 20 years' time I can assure you that when then yet another group enters our societies, and those, let's say, Muslim citizens, whether they're still Muslim, that's up to them, but let's say those who are seen as the Islamic part of our society, I would not be surprised if they then would say, well, yeah, but maybe we should stop them, because they are the villains. And you also already see this happening within, for example, the Turkish, let's say the Dutch-Turkish community or the German-Turkish, that within there are already, let's say, part of them who often, because they don't adhere to Islam anymore, that they, let's say, shift to, and also sometimes join even radical right-wing parties. So I'm afraid this is human nature, not maybe the most glorifying aspect of human nature, but yeah, you see this all the time. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think this is the moment that we will close the discussion.
Okay, thank you for coming and for the questions.